Ready to start. It's 1 o'clock. I know. You want another couple minutes? It is actually, but okay. No, we can wait.
Mine says you got 2 minutes.
Okay, then we'll use yours. Hi, folks. No, I did. I turned it on. Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for coming to this presentation from Shalom Space. We are glad you are here. I don't know. I'm Joe Sanders, and I don't know whether you were here for Lou Brownstein's talk in December. If you were, you know that you have another wonderful talk ahead of you today. Okay, so I would like to introduce Lou. Professor Louis Brownstein is a historian, author, and the former chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at SUNY New Paltz. His main area of expertise is the Middle East, especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, plural conflicts. Lou earned his PhD from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins in 1969. He has given many lectures on a wide range of topics in international affairs around the world. So his talk today will be on negotiating the terms for a Palestinian state, borders, refugees, security, water rights, settlements, and Jerusalem. Lou, welcome back. Thank you.
My wife said to me that people are getting tired of hearing all about this, given what's going on in the world. You have a problem here?
Yeah, you need to hold it
closer. Okay. I'm doing that. It's a good thing I lift weights. Right. Okay. There you go. Now you hear me. So I was saying that my wife says that folks are getting tired, they're getting worn out, and I can understand that. So I'm going to weigh you out some more. In the context of the conflict since October 7th of last year, there has been an increased call for the creation of a Palestinian state. And we hear it all the time, a two-state solution. So, oh, I got to turn this thing on. That helps. Yeah, it does. Absolutely. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it doesn't. I may have to open this door, he said. It worked before. All right. Why is it not working now? I checked it before we started. Yep. No, he took the keyboard with him, I think. I don't know. All right, let's try this. Yeah, we'll give it a shot and see what happens. Nope. Nope. Unless.
I know when to get Jeffrey.
Jeffrey, where are you? Okay. Good. All right, I'm going to get started whether we've got it working or not. So, let's remind ourselves what a state is. It is a political unit which contains territory, population. It has sovereignty over that territory, and it enjoys recognition from other states. Now, one might also add to that the possibility that the state actually has its own army and can provide for its own security. Those are the minimum requirements for having a state. And as we go over the outstanding issues, you will discover that these issues are in fact interrelated. Let's see whether we can get this to work. What happened to my clicker? What did I do with it? Oh, okay.
Let's get rid of that one.
Oh, okay. It was working before. There we go. Bless you.
Here's yours.
Okay. Okay, that's cool. That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at these three words. A two-state solution. So we're clearly saying that there are not going to be three states. It's not going to be the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. It's going to be two states, and the implication is that the Palestinian state will include Gaza and the West Bank, which right away raises some interesting problems, which we'll get to later. And the word solution, we have. What happened now?
It's on and off, Jason.
It is.
Check.
Try it now? Okay. So it implies that if we have a solution, whatever we come up with solves the problem and suggests that it's a final set of arrangements, not arrangements which would have to be renegotiated at some point in the future. And these are the five topics that I hope I'm going to get to, but I wouldn't count on it if I were you. Let's remind ourselves that we're talking about a very small piece of territory. The entire mandate of Palestine, which is represented by the map on the left, is approximately the size of New Jersey. From north to south, it's 125 miles. From east to west, it's anywhere from 40 to 50 miles. It is very, very small. And what we're talking about is partitioning it into two smaller pieces. The geographical features are worth taking a look at. And it would be if I could get. I am technologically challenged today. No, it's got nothing to do with the batteries. I changed the damn batteries before it came. I check everything. All right, so please note, the way to think about Palestine is that it is in three north-south bands. Along the coast, roughly at sea level, along the Jordan Valley, which is basically below sea level, and the Judean Hills, which run here from the Jezreel Valley down towards the Negev. And that suggests that the taller or the higher territory is in the center of Palestine, and the east and western zones are underneath the Judean hills, which overlook them, which represents a major strategic problem in the discussions we're going to have now. So the first question is, where is the state going to be established? Where's it going to be located? In 2011, President Obama said, the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines and with mutually agreed upon swaps, so that the total size of the Palestinian state would be roughly equal to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. These were the boundaries of Israel from 1949 to 1967. And you'll notice, for those of you who are perhaps new to this topic, that here's your West Bank, here's the Gaza Strip. And as you will see in just a few minutes, the distance from here to here is maybe 20 miles. And the great fear that the Israelis have had from the very beginning is the idea of having a hostile state on their border. In the Oslo Agreement that was made in 1992, the West Bank was divided up into 3 zones: the A zone, the B zone, and the C zone. What I want you to pay attention to are these territories here, because this is roughly where the Palestinian population is located. And it raises the fundamental question of how do you create a state in this situation in which the Palestinian population is divided up into these small, roughly separated islands of population. This isn't the one. This is the one. Now, there have been a number of proposals as to how this could be done. And I'm going to show you a few maps. I haven't got the time, unfortunately, to go through them in the detail that they deserve. But this was the final status map that was proposed to the Palestinians in 2000 when Bill Clinton was in office, and negotiations were carried out between Clinton, Arafat, and Barak, the then Prime Minister of Israel. Palestinians were offered a state in which these were the boundaries and locations of their populations and what the state would look like. Now, you'll notice, even under the best of circumstances, this is not a contiguous territory. And the Palestinians complained about this, as you might well imagine they would. In any event, they turned this proposal down. And Clinton then proposed a map that looked something like this, in which he suggested that a corridor be created between Gaza and the West Bank, and that these little pieces here be separated out from the Palestinian state and annexed to Israel, for reasons that I will make clear as we proceed. Roughly around the same time, there was a meeting between 2 individuals. One was a guy by the name of Abu Mazen, whom you may know as the current leader of the Palestinian National Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. And that Abu Mazen is his nom de guerre. And Yossi Beilin, a leader of the Israeli left, they meet in Geneva and they come up with this map. And they say, okay, we will carve out these territories and this territory and this territory. That will become part of the Jewish state. And the rest will be the state of Palestine along with Gaza, which is not shown here. So this was roughly the best that you can think of in terms of the boundaries of Palestine as they were proposed during these various negotiations. This is not the way Israeli leaders have thought about this issue. They have thought about it in terms of Israeli security. And after conquering the West Bank in 1967, they asked themselves the question, how do we avoid a situation in which we have a state on our border 7 to 8 miles from the Mediterranean Sea? How do we change the situation in which this short distance runs a risk of creating a major security threat to us of invasion and occupation? Second, how do we do this so that we don't end up in occupation of the Palestinians on this territory? So there were two goals that they set themselves. One, to have security over the entire territory so they can control it militarily. And secondly, not to rule the Palestinians directly. The idea was, do I love having two of these things? The idea was that you would divide the territory up basically in two ways. You would create a zone where the Palestinians lived that would not be under Israeli control and would not be part of the Israeli state. So now if you look at this map, there are areas in yellow that you can see both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And if you'll remember from the previous map that I showed you, that's basically where the Palestinian populations live. And then there were territories to the east, here, the brown territories, and this corridor across the center of the West Bank, those were to be retained by Israel. The rest to be returned to Jordan. This was the so-called Shalom plan of 1968. Right after the war, Israel offered to return most of the territories back to the countries which had lost them in that war, and to divide up the West Bank, the way I show you here now, return the population back to Jordan, so they would not be part of Israel, and retain control over the Jordan Valley here and these areas here. Now, because there were so many Palestinians living in this area, that basic boundary could not change and remain roughly the same under most of the proposals that Israel made when they were discussing the possibility of giving the territory up. Now, at the time that this was proposed, nobody was thinking in terms of a Palestinian state. But the basic problem of population and territory remains down to the present day. When Israel occupies the West Bank in 1967, there are no Jews living in the West Bank or over what we call the Green Line. The Green Line was the boundary that separated Israel from Jordan and from Egypt and from Syria. That is obviously not the case today. The question of the settlements is central to the current discussion about what might or might not become the Palestinian state. Since 1967, Israel has spent billions, tens of billions of dollars building settlements across the Green Line. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that all of these settlements are the same, but they are not. There are, in fact, 5 different types of settlements. And it's important to keep in mind what kinds of settlements we're talking about when we come to the question of what might be done with these settlements in the event of a Palestinian state. First, neighborhoods around Jerusalem, which I will show you in a little while. Israel builds very large neighborhood blocks around the edge of Jerusalem across the line in what we'll call East Jerusalem. And I'll show you where they are in a little while, so we won't dwell on that right now. Those settlement blocks were included in the expanded definition of Jerusalem after 1967. So from the Israeli point of view, these aren't settlements at all. They are part and parcel of the state of Israel. They've been annexed, and there is no way that Israel is going to agree to give them up. And as you will see, there are a lot of people living there. Secondly, the Hall settlements. I'll show you where these are too. These are the security settlements along the Jordan Valley. If you remember the Woodland plan, the idea was to hold that territory and maintain security control over it. Those settlements are tiny little settlements. Not very many people live in them, but they're there for security purposes. Cities. There are a number of fairly large cities that the Israelis have created. The two major ones are Ma'ale Adumim, I'll show you where that is, and Ariel. And I'll give you the populations of each of these in a minute. And then there are religious nationalist settlements. I'll show you a map in a minute, which will indicate which of the settlements in the West Bank are religious settlements and which ones are secular settlements. And finally, there are the illegal settlements, those that have been created without the agreement of the Israeli government. There's a long history of building settlements overnight in Palestine, and many, particularly religious nationalists, have been engaged in this activity with increasing frequency in recent years. So, you can't see this where you are. That's why I'm showing it to you. But basically, each one of these names up on the board, those are settlements. And some of them are religious nationalist settlements, and some of them are secular settlements. Most of the people who live in settlements across the Green Line are not religious nationalists. Most of them live in these settlements because it's cheaper to buy there, and they can commute from those settlements into Israel proper for their respective jobs. So if I showed you a map with highways and streets leading into Israel, you would see that there are a whole series of roads that go across the boundary from the West Bank into Israel proper. Now, you will recall, you will, in a previous map that I showed you, when it was suggesting what territories would end up in Israel and which ones would remain in the Palestinian state, that I showed you this area here, this area up here, which were going to be carved out and turned over to Israel. Why? Because that's where most of the Israelis are living. Ma'ale Adumim is located just here outside Jerusalem on the road from the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem itself. That was a settlement which was created in order to control the strategic road from Jordan into Israel proper. It was built for strategic reasons, but it has become a major population center ever since. And now if you look at this again, you can see where these major settlements are to be located. So here they are. You can see how it's carved out this way and up here. And although there are settlements, and the Hall settlements, by the way, are over here, these settlements, of which you see on the map here were those created up until the year 2010. Since 2010, there haven't been new settlements. There have been expansions in the size of the old settlements. So, total, there are 600,000 Israelis living in 144 settlements, 12 of them in East Jerusalem, and 100 illegal outposts. In East Jerusalem alone, remember that coastal green line that I mentioned to you before, there are 200,000 Israelis living. Ma'ale Adumim has 38,000, and Ariel has roughly 20,000. Those numbers are probably not entirely accurate right now because those settlements continue to grow in size. So the question becomes, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I wish I did, but I don't. So the question becomes, which we'll examine in just a moment, what are you going to do with the settlements if you create a Palestinian state in the territory which I showed you, under the best of circumstances, would represent that state? So first of all, notice, this line is the boundary between West and East Jerusalem prior to 1967. After 1967, Israel expanded the size of Jerusalem to include all of this territory here. Every one of these triangles represents a Jewish neighborhood across that green line. Part of what the Palestinians demand is that those settlements, those neighborhoods, be abolished and the populations returned back to Israel proper. You can imagine for yourself how realistic a demand that might be. Now, you might notice something else, by the way, which is very interesting. These are Arab towns, Homa, Sarawan, Wadi Joz, all up in here, Shalom. These are Palestinian villages incorporated into the city of Jerusalem, and Palestinians still live in large numbers in those villages within the boundaries of the state of Israel, if you include Jerusalem as part of that state, which is, of course, Israelis do. Now, there's Ma'ale Adumim, and to give you some sense of the size of this is an aerial photograph of 3 Israeli neighborhoods immediately across the green line in East Jerusalem. And here are 2 towns, I guess we would say. One is the town of Piskat Ze'ev. This is right outside Jerusalem, by the way. Not in the city of Jerusalem, but just outside. Here is the Israeli settlement, and here is an Arab refugee camp. We'll turn to the refugees in just a moment. Please note, if a Palestinian state were to be created, and those neighborhoods in East Jerusalem were to remain part of the state of Israel, now that would mean that the Arabs living in the small villages in East Jerusalem would still be within the state of Israel. They would have the option, one presumes, of becoming citizens of the state of Israel, because the Israelis have offered to all Arabs living in East Jerusalem, in the expanded size of the city, to become citizens of the state and vote in the elections. The Palestinians have refused to do so until now, but that option is always, of course, open to them. Which raises the interesting question. Are these two states, presumably we end up with two of them, to be uniquely Israeli and Palestinian with no minority populations from the other side? Now, right away, the answer to that is no, because 20% of the population of Israel is, of course, Arab, Palestinian Arab, which would suggest that a Palestinian state might well have Jews living in it, in the settlements which are across the line that we've looked at up until now. You with me? The Palestinian position is absolutely not. All Jews living in the territory which would become part of our state have to leave. And that would mean, if we say that 300,000 are living in East Jerusalem, 400,000 are living outside East Jerusalem. And that would suggest that you're allowed to uproot 400,000 Israelis, send them back into Israel in order for you to create a Palestinian state. Those are your two choices, right? I mean, either they stay where they are or they don't. Now, if they stay where they are, would they be citizens of the state of Israel? Or would they be citizens of the new Palestinian state? Would they vote in the Palestinian elections? I can tell you right now, no Palestinian I've ever heard would ever countenance such an outcome. Well, let's talk about the refugees. I'm sorry, wait, I got another map to show you, or chart at least. This marks the growth in settler population from 1970 up until 2005. Total settler population is represented by the top red line. So as you can see, that population keeps growing, and the more it grows, the more it becomes an issue for how you might create a Palestinian state. Now, let's talk about refugees, because they are at the center of much of the debate about creation of a state. This is a map of Israel after 1949. Every number that you see on that map represents a Palestinian village that was destroyed from 1947 to 1948. And all of the Palestinian refugees, which we'll talk about in just a moment, come from these villages. Okay. Right now, there are 450,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, 2,300,000 in Jordan, 500,000 in Syria, 774,000 in the West Bank, and 1.3 million in Gaza. That does not include Palestinians living in the diaspora outside the Middle East. And there are at least another million out there. Nobody knows exactly how many there are. So, they live in refugee camps. Those who are refugees from 1948. Oh, think about that for a minute. 1948. I think it's 2024, is it not? All right. How many of the Palestinian refugees from 1948 are still alive? And the answer is very few, as you might well imagine. We all want to live forever, but we won't. And many of them have died. And what we're talking about are their descendants. Now, if you are the descendant of a refugee, are you still a refugee? Well, according to the United Nations, yes, you are, if you are Palestinian. Nowhere else in the world is this true, by the way. Only with this population. And the population of refugees is maintained by the UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, created after World War II, initially to deal with the refugees from World War II, but ultimately becoming the representative organization for the Palestinians themselves. So, what does it mean to be a refugee in this context? Remember the villages that I showed you. And let me show you one other map. Oops. I am missing the map I want. Can't believe I didn't bring it. Okay, I'll have to show it to you myself. Not as well organized as I thought it was. The refugees who fled in 1948 ended up in 4 places. They ended up in the Gaza Strip. They ended up in the West Bank, in Lebanon and Syria. And then a few other places as well, but let's take those 4. If you were a Palestinian refugee who ended up in the West Bank or Gaza, you were still in Palestine. You weren't in your home, but you were in Palestine. So, if a Palestinian state is created, and the Palestinians pass the same law that the Israelis passed, namely the right of return law, which says that if you are a Jew, you can make aliyah to Israel and become a citizen of the state. So the Palestinians might well pass a law like that. If you're a Palestinian, you can come back to, whoops, we got a problem. And the problem we have is they don't want to come back to the West Bank and Gaza. They're already there. What they want to return to are the villages they came from. And those villages are not available to them. Those villages have all been destroyed. One of the central issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is how to define a refugee and how to define what the rights of the refugee are in a context like this. Let me try and nail the point home a bit more. Let's suppose that I were to make aliyah to Israel. I'm not going to do that, by the way, but let's assume for the moment that I would. I'd sell everything here and I would fly to Israel. I would land at Tel Aviv Airport, Ben Gurion. I would announce to the Israeli government I'm home. I've returned to the land of Israel. Of course, I've never been there, perhaps, but I'm returning. And it's wonderful, lovely to have you. Your citizenship papers, now you are an Israeli. And where do I live? Well, wherever I can. I can live anywhere from Matua in the north to Eilat in the south. And no matter where I am, I'm in the land of Israel. Okay. Now we have a Palestinian who's living in the El Al refugee camp outside of Jerusalem. He's 5 miles from his old village. In fact, he can see the village from his back porch. And if you say to him, where are you from? He will say, where? And say, wait a minute, that's Israel. If you want to live in a Palestinian state and come back to the state, you're there already. But not in his eyes. So here is one of the fundamental conundrums about creating a Palestinian state. The Palestinians would have to accept the idea that the refugees living in their midst would have to accept the West Bank and Gaza as their national territory. Remember that we said in the beginning of this discussion, 2-state solution. Solution means end of discussion after we're done here. Now, in 2000, when the Palestinians were offered a state under President Clinton, Arafat turned it down. He turned it down for two reasons. He said to Clinton, if I accept this and I go back, they'll kill me. And second, we cannot give up the right of refugees to return to their homes. Now, this is, I think, from everything that I know, a rock bottom requirement of Palestinian nationalism. And how do you get beyond this if you're going to create a state in which you do not get to live on the territory that you define as your national territory? Would a state of the West Bank and Gaza meet the Palestinian demand for national territory and solve the refugee problem? There's more to this. I knew you'd think there was. What about the 500,000 refugees in Lebanon? How about the 500,000 refugees in Syria? Now, this is not going to come as a surprise to those of you who follow the Middle East at all, but the Arabs in the other countries don't give a damn about Palestinians. And yeah, they talk about it and they demonstrate about it, and it's an issue in their politics, but they don't care about them. So one of the possibilities might well be you create a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and then the Lebanese say, oh, cool, you have a state now. Go. Take your 500,000 people and go to your new state. If you think that's not possible, after the first Gulf War, Kuwait kicked out every Palestinian in their country, 350,000 of them. There's precedent for this. And the question is, how you would solve the problem of the refugees under these circumstances. So, okay, we've covered everything. Well, not quite. It is, I think, impossible for those of us who live here in a secular democratic state, which we do, to understand the emotional, political, and national attachment to Jerusalem. It is at the heart of Jewish and Palestinian identity. It is also, by the way, at the heart of Muslim identity. Christians think about it too from time to time, but they don't attempt to go back to it. They go, they visit with, Jesus was here and Mary was there, and oh, this is great, and I'm going home. For the Jews, leading and controlling Jerusalem is at the center of their national core identity. In the 48 War, when the Israelis' back was to the wall, and it looked like they were about to lose the war in the first phase, Ben-Gurion gave orders to his military leaders, you must take Jerusalem. You must take Jerusalem because without Jerusalem, there is no Jewish state. Without Jerusalem, we don't have a Jewish identity. The Jewish identity is part and parcel of their presence in Jerusalem. So in 1947, there was an international zone proposed for Jerusalem, which never emerged because of the 48 War. I showed you a map roughly like this before, where Israel expanded her presence in Jerusalem, the goal being to make sure that this city never goes back to anybody else's control but hers. Every single one of these neighborhoods is built on a former Jordanian military site. So it not only establishes a Jewish presence, it creates a security system. I'm going to skip this. So you've all seen pictures of this, and I imagine you have a pretty good idea what you're looking at. This is the Western Wall, which is the western wall of the Temple Mount. This is the Dome of the Rock, and you would think, oh, that's the mosque that really matters. But actually, it isn't. In fact, it's not a mosque at all. There's the mosque. You see it? Here. That's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that is the holy spot for the Palestinians and for Muslims on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, that's this area. Here. Somewhere on that platform, there was a Jewish temple. And the conflict over this spot goes on day after day after day. Now, there are Jews, not the majority anywhere like a majority who want this, who call for the destruction of the two edifices on the Temple Mount, the reconstruction of the Jewish temple. And they're actively attempting to accomplish this objective. They're not going to, I don't think, but they've tried under various circumstances to do so. There was some years ago, 68, I think, a conspiracy to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque so that the land could be cleared for a Jewish temple. Nobody knows exactly where the temple was, although the suspicion is that it was located roughly where the Dome of the Rock is now. How do you divide up control over this spot, which is central to the identity of both of these peoples? And if you have a Palestinian state and they want to be in East Jerusalem, do they get to keep this? And the answer within the Israeli community is absolutely not. And then the Palestinian community is absolutely. Enjoy that thought. Land resources. Now, when I began studying this topic, you said something about land resources. I would have said to you, what land resources? There aren't any. Turns out there are. And they're not insignificant. First of all, in the West Bank, there are a number of minerals which are mined. They have no great significance. The thing we want to start spending time looking at are natural gas resources, which have now been discovered in the Eastern Mediterranean in the zone that's shown on this map. There are billions of dollars of natural gas which the Israelis have discovered since, I think, 2010. It's worth tens of billions of dollars. Now, if you have a Palestinian state, do they get any share of this? Do they have any claim on it? It's an issue that nobody talks about, but it seems to me it's crucial to understanding some of what's going on here. Oh, shale oil. They've discovered shale oil. The hell was it doing there? Well, there it is. In the Negev, part of Palestine, the original Palestine. And not surprisingly, Palestinians know about this, and they want a piece of it. But it's water that is at the core of the resources we're talking about. Now, what's interesting about this topic is the Israelis have built probably the world's most sophisticated water provision system. for any country on the planet. And if you look at this map, hang on, there, this one. This is where the desalinization plants are. 55% of Israel's drinking water now comes from desalinization plants. Yeah. It is a huge amount. And they also control the water resources of the territory from the Golan Heights, where much of it begins, to the Kinneret, or Lake Galilee, if you like, down to a water system that distributes it throughout the region. And then we have the aquifers. And you get water from the aquifers by drilling into the aquifers and getting water. So I get my water. Yeah, I have a well. Nobody looks at my aquifer. Everybody looks at these aquifers. And what's happening is, in terms of the aquifers, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Jordanians are using 110% of the available water, which means the aquifers are declining. And as the aquifers decline, water dries up. So one of the things that's happening, by the way, is the Dead Sea is drying up. If you look at pictures of the Dead Sea 20 years ago and today, you will see that the Dead Sea has receded. When I was first going to Israel, I would go to the hotels along the coast of the Dead Sea, and walk out the door and jump in the Dead Sea, float around, and you bob like a cork. It's a lot of fun, and it lasts for about 10 minutes to get the hell out of there. But if you want to do it now, you got to take a cart pulled by a tractor to get you down to the Dead Sea, because it's receded about, I think the last time I saw it, 300 yards. And in time, this keeps up, it will disappear. So we have a struggle over water, over oil, over gas. Who gets what? Now, every single topic that I have introduced you to this afternoon would have to be negotiated in the context of the creation of a Palestinian state. There are those who say, well, let's just recognize the Palestinian state. And I think it was France who said they were seriously thinking about doing that. And I thought, go ahead. It's not going to do you any good. There is no state. Land, population, sovereignty, recognition. If you get recognition, but you don't have the other three, you don't have a state. So, I hope I've covered the topics you expected me to. I told you I'd get through all of it. And now, if you have questions, we have a microphone you can ask.
Thank you so much. That was really enlightening and devastating. Yeah. So where was the world back in 1947 or 49 when all of these Palestinian villages were, all the Palestinians were made to leave and the villages were demolished? Where was the world then? Now, I do realize it was soon after World War II, and people obviously were very upset about what happened during the Holocaust.
Of course. Well, first of all, there's a book, The Origins of the Palestinian Refugee Problem by Benny Morris. If you're interested in the Palestinian issue and the refugee issue, and you feel like doing some reading, that's the book you have to read. There isn't any other. And what it does in that book is it makes clear how each of the respective Palestinian communities ended up being refugees. They were not all expelled. There were large numbers of them who left voluntarily. It happens in every war. The war starts, people start getting killed, bombs are going off all over the place. You grab your kids and you go. And you assume you're going to come back. In 1936, there was a Palestinian uprising. And it was very brutal, and it lasted for 3 years. 20,000 Palestinians fled to Lebanon during that uprising. They all came back. So there was some history of that. Now, there were also areas in Israel-Palestine where they were forcibly evicted. The most notorious of this was around the towns of Lida, near what is now the Ben Gurion Airport. And Ben Gurion gave the order to expel the Palestinians from there in order to create a strategic zone to protect what was now emerging as the Jewish state. Some were expelled, some fled. In terms of their respective claims, it doesn't matter. If you used to live in a village and you want to go back to it, whether your grandparents, or I guess in this case, great-grandparents, left voluntarily or were expelled, from your point of view, the claim to that village remains extant. And I can tell you that in discussion after discussion after discussion with Palestinians, I heard the same refrain again and again. The world didn't respond. I'll get that in a moment. The world didn't respond because there was nothing particularly unusual about this under the context. In 1919, I guess, 1819, there was an exchange of population between Greece and Turkey. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks and Turks changed places. The world said, too bad, but such is life. At the end of World War II, 3 million Germans were expelled from Russia and Eastern Europe into Germany. So, there they are, to this day. Nobody suggests that they be allowed to return to their respective homes. The Palestinians see this very differently. And they don't see it the way in which others have historically seen refugee issues in other contexts. Quite frankly, we live in a world of refugees. Just ask Donald Trump, he'll tell you. And not mine. Because conflicts generate refugees. In this particular national conflict, however, we're not going to get a redefinition of this problem by the Palestinians themselves. I'll give you one example to illustrate this. And I can give you so many more. In 1975, I was living in Jerusalem and I took a trip to the Sinai. And along the road, we stopped for, we were on a bus. We stopped for some refreshment, and I see a bunch of Palestinian youth standing by the road. So I went over to talk to them. And I had about 30, 40 of these guys standing around me. They were on their way to Tel Aviv because they were working there. So I got talking to one young man who spoke English, and I said to him, "Where are you from?" He said, "Oh, I'm from Ashkelon." Now, I knew better. So the way you do interviews very often is you act dumb. So I said, "Oh, you live in Ashkelon?" He said, "No, I don't live in Ashkelon. I live in Gaza." I said, well, I'm confused now. How can you be from Ashkelon if you live in Gaza? His answer was, "My family comes from Ashkelon." What are you, an idiot? My mother has the key. She put it in her bosom. Now, that expression, putting the key in her bosom, if I've heard it 100 times, that's probably an understatement. It is a constant refrain. The basic point being, I never gave up my ancestral home. It's still mine. Yeah, well, there's somebody else living there. Well, get him out. It's mine. Okay. Any other questions?
Professor, why do you think so many of the other Arab countries hold Palestinians in such disdain?
Boy, what a good question that is. I had a colleague of mine who was a Palestinian Arab living in Bethlehem. He was a dean at the local university there. He was Christian, as it happens, and he came from Ein Kerem, which is a small village to the west of Bethlehem, and his folks were forced out during the 48 War, and he was a refugee. And I asked him the same question, and he said, "You don't understand. In the Arab context, when you lose your land, you lose your identity. So you are now not just stateless, you are landless. And you put at risk everybody around you who has their land. So, for one thing, you become an object of disdain and contempt. Now, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is Palestinians living in other people's territories, particularly in Lebanon, create an enormous security problem. When the Palestinians came in, they upset the ethnic balance in Lebanon, which, as you may know, is very fragile. And Lebanese blame the Palestinians for the civil war that they suffered from 1975 to roughly 1990. Now, whether that's accurate or not is another matter. They remember the depredations of Arafat and the PLO when the PLO was ensconced in southern Lebanon and created a state within a state. It's interesting to note that when the Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1982, they were initially welcomed as liberators. Now, that didn't last. Nobody likes to be occupied. But they hated the Palestinians, absolutely hated them. And you may recall the Sabra Shatila massacres at the end of the 1982 war, when a group of Maronite Christians attacked Palestinian refugee camps outside of Beirut because they blamed them for the assassination of their leader. Women and children who had been left defenseless because the PLO had left Lebanon in the context of that war were massacred by the Christians. There's nothing new about this. This is an ethnic cauldron. And in that context, the Palestinians create imbalance and thereby undermine the security of the populations that are living there. In Jordan, got a whole other problem. Jordan was ruled by the Hashemites. The Hashemites are Bedouin from Saudi Arabia. They are supported by the other Bedouin in Jordan, who represent 30% maybe of the population. The rest of the population are all Palestinian. And those Palestinians are related by blood to the Palestinians on the West Bank. You follow all this? So what happens is they represent, from the point of view of the king, a security threat within his own state, which has become problematic for every single king since the end of the Israeli war. The first king, Abdullah, was assassinated by a Palestinian on the in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, by the way, in 1951, I believe. Well, Hussein, who ultimately became king, had to fight a civil war with the Palestinians, with the PLO. 20,000 of them died in that war. And they were expelled to Lebanon. And the Palestinians in Jordan now are very unhappy with the king because of his connections to Israel. So I hope that answers your question. My pleasure.
Question,
Behind you there.
Could you say some more about the Israeli settlements, the illegal ones? Sometimes you hear about on the news that some of the settlers are shooting the Palestinians. And also you hear a lot of them have dual citizenship, United States and Israel, which makes one think about certain settlements within New York City or around here.
On a map where I can show you this. Okay, that'll do. So, there is something very unsettling which is occurring in the territories as we speak. In the Jordan Valley, along this area here, which is virtually all desert, by the way, nothing grows there. And the people who live in those areas are Bedouin. And they have they're living on their ancestral lands, not bothering anybody. And what's happening is that Israeli settlers from the surrounding communities have been putting pressure on them to leave. And many of them have, forcing them to flee into the A zone, the area of the West Bank, which is under the responsibility of the Palestinian National Authority. So there's land dispossession taking place now as we speak. Now, yeah, there are American Olim, I guess, who have been involved in this. But that's not the way to look at this, however significant that might be under other contexts. This is part and parcel of a religious nationalist revival in the Jewish community in the West Bank that has grown apace under Netanyahu's leadership for the last 20 years. And if we had the time, and we don't, I could trace the history of this back to the 1967 war. I'll say just this much about it. The 1967 war convinced some religious Jews that the Jews were favored by God because they won the war in the way in which they did, and gave them the opportunity now to claim all of Eretz Israel. The core of the Jewish presence in Palestine, the place that you will find all remains, archaeologically speaking, of Jewish presence in this area of the world, is here. If you go down to the coast, you won't find anything. That's where the Philistines lived. That's where the Phoenicians lived. If you go to the east, there's the Moabites and the Ammonites. That's where they lived. But if you are in the West Bank and you dig into the ground, you find Jewish presence. So their point being, if we're going to have a Jewish state, it has to be here. It has to be where Jews have historically lived. Now, whatever you may think of that argument, and I can just imagine, it puts them at direct conflict with the Palestinians living on territory that they believe Jews own by right. I remember I once went to Shiloh, which was the biblical location of the Ark of the Covenant. And I was taken around by an American only, who was a terrorist that doesn't disturb him. I haven't got time for it. And I said to him, well, what are you doing here? You're from New York, for crying out loud. What are you doing here? He said, you don't understand. God took Abraham up on the mountain and he said, all the land you see from up here belongs to the Jewish people. Now, I just listened because it's not my job to argue. But he really believed this. This was part and parcel of his core identity. And in that, he shares that view with many others living in that territory as well. Any other questions? If not, thank you all so much for coming.